and welcome to Series 6 of In Suspense, a podcast and vodcast for fans and writers of crime fiction, our new series of minisodes with author and editor Phoebe Morgan. Phoebe Morgan is a best-selling author and award-winning editor. She studied English at Leeds University after growing up in the Suffolk countryside. She has previously worked as a journalist and now edits commercial fiction for a publishing house during the day and writes her own books in the evenings. She lives in London, and you can follow her on Twitter, Instagram at Phoebe and Morgan, Facebook at Phoebe Morgan Author, or find her blog about publishing and writing, which is really good, by the way, at www.phoebemorganauthor.com. And we'll put all those details on the site for you. We'll list it on the website. Her books have sold over 225,000 copies and been translated into 10 languages, including French, Italian, Norwegian, Polish, and Croatian. Her new thriller, The Wild Girls, will be published by William Morrow in the US. Her books are also on sale in Canada and Australia. Phoebe has also contributed short stories to Afraid of the Light, a 2020 crime writing anthology with proceeds going to the Samaritans, Noir from the Bar, a crime collection with proceeds going to the NHS, and Afraid of the Christmas Lights, with all profits going to domestic abuse charities. Her 4 thrillers can be read in any order, and her next book, The Trip, will publish in February 2023. And you can find links to buy Phoebe's books in the description of the podcast and on our YouTube channel.
Yes, I won't forget to do that. So as before, each episode will be around, each minisode, I should say, will be around 10 minutes long, and we'll focus on different aspects of the editing process. So without further ado, let's crack on with the lovely Phoebe Morgan.
Thank you.
Hello, Phoebe, and welcome to our 5th and penultimate episode, or minisode rather, which today is about messy drafts or edit as you go. Now, every author has their own way of writing novels, and no one method is necessarily better or worse than another. But as a writer yourself, how do you approach the drafting process? Do you tend to write, as fast as you can, all in one go without tweaking, or do you like to refine your work as you go?
So I try to make myself write it in one draft without going back too much. I work full time during the week, so I have to write at the weekends, and I can write quite a lot if I have like a clear weekend or even just a clear Saturday. And so I find if I sit down, I can do several thousand words in a day and just write a really big chunk. And then what I do is I usually sort of save the manuscript and send it to myself via email, because also I'm always really worried about losing it, which has happened before. So I'm always backing it up and saving it, and then I do put it on my Kindle and reread it from the beginning as a draft. But I try to avoid actually tweaking the writing until I've got either maybe not to the very end, but like pretty close to the end, because otherwise I just think I'll never get it finished, because I'll just spend ages sort of tinkering around. So I do try and get the whole thing down, and then I go back and edit, and then obviously I'll do the round of edits with my actual editor as well. But for me it's very much sort of a very messy first draft and then go back. But I know people have different techniques, and I don't think there's one right way of doing it. Most of my authors have different techniques.
Yes. Yeah, I have a very different technique. I do sort of edit as I go. But I think, Lauren, you're more of a getting the draft down quickly, aren't you?
Well, I am. But interestingly, with my new book I'm writing, where I'm in the middle of it, I have been doing a lot of editing, because we're sending the first section off to the publisher to have a look at. And so I have done a lot of editing, and I think that's one of the reasons I'm struggling in the middle now, is because I've sort of been jumping back and forth with it. And actually, yes, I much prefer, I think, to plough ahead. But it is it's such a personal thing, and it's all as is with planning and pantsing. And I mean, I read books and I think, wow, this plot is so complicated. And then I find out that person just completely pantsed it, and I'm like, how did that happen? And so I wondered, do you think there's advantages and disadvantages of sort of planning or pantsing? And can you notice when your authors have done it one way or the other?
Other advantages, I think one of the advantages of just writing is I think of it as saving time in a way, because I know that what I write will change. So I suppose I don't want to tinker loads with a first draft beginning or middle or whatever, because it will change. Like I might get to the ending, and to be honest, in most of my books I've got to the end and then I've thought of another twist, so I've sort of added in a twist which has then meant the beginning has to change, and there's sort of, I have to feed that twist back to the start. And so I think for me, if I spend ages tinkering with the opening, it is kind of a waste of time because it will change. So I suppose that's kind of one advantage to just sort of going for it. I think planners probably do put more time in, like to the skill of sort of crafting and plotting, and that sort of almost mathematical sort of puzzle making idea of piecing a plot together before you've actually started writing it. And that's something I find really hard. I would really like to be better at that. And weirdly, I can do it for other people. So I've done a couple of IP projects at work where I've come up with the idea for the story and plotted it out and then given it to one of our authors. And you wouldn't necessarily know that it's an IP project, but it is. And that's quite easy for me. But I think when it's my own book, I find it much harder. It's sort of like a bit of a mental block when it comes to planning it out from start to finish. In terms of, I think and I think you probably do spend more time getting to know your book and your characters if you do plan it out, because if you're spending I know authors that spend a couple of months doing that before they even start writing, and so automatically they will know the book in slightly more detail, whereas someone who's a pantser will sort of get to know the book as they go, and there may be more heavy lifting to do at the other end. So it's sort of about where you want to position your workload, and for me, I'd rather write it and then do the work, because mentally, once I've got a first draft, it's a huge relief. And there's always, even though I've written 5 books now, I'm always like, oh, I'll never be able to write another one, and that was a fluke, and so I think there's that relief when I've done a first draft, and I worry that if I spent 2 months planning, I just then wouldn't write the novel, and I'd feel that sense of that I've got to still write it hanging over me a lot. So and in terms of whether I can tell, I'm not sure. No one's ever really asked me that. I think you can definitely tell if an author has spent a long time polishing a novel with their agent, because it often is in just a better shape and it's in better condition, and there is a big difference between the quality, I think, of those books and books that have just come in and maybe the agent isn't as hands-on editorially, and you can tell like no one's necessarily looked it over. But that's okay, and I can then put that work in, but you can tell that there's a difference. And I think I can tell as well if an author has done their edits quite quickly, and I never blame them for it, because I know it's like you just want to get it back off your desk, but sometimes I'll say, go away and have a think about this and then come back to me. And if they come back within a couple of days and they're like, oh, here it is, and I just think, I don't think you've actually done it. It's like you have done it on paper, but you haven't really done it quite in the way that it needs to be done. So and there is that impulse, just to get the work done and to send it off again. So I do understand it, but usually it means I have to then push back and say, sorry, can you do it? Can you try and do it again?
So I'm going to dive in with an extra question. Sorry that I haven't actually planned for, so I apologise putting you on the spot. But with and it's book 2 in a contract, or book 3, so you've obviously already signed that author. Do you prefer them to still have had an editorial process with their agent, or would you rather see it because you're going to have to be putting the work in on it?
I don't mind. It's really up to them. I think it really depends on the agent. So some agents, once they've done the deal, will be kind of more hands off, and they'll say, actually it's the editor's job now, and they don't want to tread on toes, and they'll just sort of send me the script and we'll, do other things. But I know there are some agents who still are very involved in the editorial process. I don't really have a preference. I think it really depends on, how much work the author needs, how they feel about that particular book, because there are some authors who maybe have written 2 or 3 brilliant books and then they're just sort of struggling with the 4th one, or they just for whatever reason are finding this one harder to connect to, and so then they want more input from me and maybe more from their agent as well. And recently I had a novel where myself and the agent and the US editor all had sort of a big brainstorm and a phone call about what we were going to do in this next round of edits, and that's quite nice to work as a team and just all be on the same page. And I think it also helps the author for the agent to be involved, because sometimes I do have to go back and say, look, I'm really sorry, but this manuscript isn't really ready yet. I'm going to have to ask you to do a bit more work in these areas. And if the agent can then sort of back me up and also act as a bit of an emotional support to the author, that's really helpful. And that is part of their job, because although I try and do that to an extent, I can't always do it in quite the same way as an agent can, because an agent might have that closer relationship and also might be able to be more honest with an agent than they are with an editor sometimes, I think. So so I do still feel like agents are a really key part of the process, but equally, you know, if they say actually it's over to you now, that's also fine. It just depends on the individual.
I think you're right. It's not that you're dishonest with your editor, it's just that you probably feel able to express your own fears or vulnerabilities or concerns.
Yeah,
honestly.
I yeah, I mean, I always want my authors to be honest with me, so you definitely, you know, if you're one of my authors listening, you definitely can be, but I do think naturally it's a different relationship, because an agent might have been with you through several publishers, or you know, through your whole career. And you know, I know my agent has listened to lots of worries that I would never voice to my publisher, so I think it is just a different dynamic. And I think I sometimes think authors worry about bothering their editors. I sometimes get authors email me and say, oh, I'm really sorry to bother you, or sorry to do this, and that makes me sad, because I just think, well, you're not bothering me, this is my job. I mean, obviously I try and have boundaries, because some authors don't always get that, but I think, you know, it is my job, and they're there to support you, and your editor should listen to you and support you. And like I said at the beginning, it is a team effort making a book, and no one can really do it. I don't believe that people can do it on their own, so I'm always happy to.
Not, no, it really is a team effort, and I think you know, you every book benefits from a really strong editorial process, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, Phoebe, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for listening to our Minisode with author and editor Phoebe Morgan, and thank you, Phoebe, for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Yes, and if you've enjoyed this minisode, do remember to check out Phoebe's full episode, which is series 5, episode 7 on location. But for now, it's time to say goodbye from Phoebe. Goodbye from Leslie, and goodbye from me. Bye.